Well, I want to welcome everyone to our agronomic teleconference. Tonight it's going to be on the Potassium Paradox, and it's an article that was written by 3 researchers at the University of Illinois, my alma mater, and it talks a lot about potassium chloride versus potassium sulfate, and some of the detriments with potassium chloride. And we'll get into that, and then we'll also be talking about some seed coating research that we're pretty darn excited about that was conducted by Byron Seed out of Indiana, corn company out central Indiana, or west central Indiana, I guess. But I want to do some introductions. We have Dave Prestholt, the sales manager for Profit Pro. I'm Dennis Clockengay, the crop management consultant, and I'll be the moderator. And then we have Ken Hamilton on from Utah, and we have Jim Ladley from Profit Pro on as well. So, as I was mentioning, the Potassium Paradox, it was research conducted by 3 researchers, all from the Soils Department from the University of Illinois, S.A. Kahn, R.L. Mulvaney, and T.R. Ellsworth. And how this started was the researcher, the main author of the paper, Saeed Khan, I'm not even sure how to pronounce that, but he's a native of Pakistan. He recounts the story of when he was in Pakistan, a Pakistani man was making mud walls from a mixture of clay and KCl fertilizer, or the regular potash that's sold at, most of the co-ops, and that's potassium chloride is what it is. And Kahn states the man was using the same bag of fertilizer that farmers had used to fertilize their soils. Kahn then realized that KCl changes the soil's physical properties, which can inhibit plant growth and discourage root systems. So he's getting this into his mind that potassium chloride, what we've been taught, is such a great fertilizer, supplies potassium, and that's what everybody uses, and it's the greatest thing. And then he's seeing something totally different, that potassium chloride is actually causing this mud house to become stronger and become more like cement, and becoming, basically destroying the structure of that house. And it's going to do the similar types of things to your soil, is what he's thinking. And so that's why he wrote this paper. He starts out in the paper, I kind of moved along to like page 5, to potassium soil test levels for the surface soil increased over 51 years of cropping from 1955 to 2005. And what he's doing there is he looked at the rotation of corn on corn and a corn oats hay rotation, and he noticed that the highest increases came when the when fertilizer was not applied, when NPK was not used. That's when the potassium levels that were needed, and they were needed with high amounts for corn on corn and the corn oats hay rotation. You need a lot of potassium for that, is what they, theoretically think. But what he found was that those on those 2 rotations, the potassium levels actually went up, even though they weren't putting potassium on. Okay, what does this mean and why? Well, what I believe it means is the more biology, the better nutrient cycling we have. So basically, when that residue breaks down, you're going to get that potassium back into that soil, and the biology is going to break the residue down, and that potassium is going to become available to the plant and to the soil. And really, over the last 18 years, I think, kind of when Roundup technology really started hitting, around 1995, we had Roundup Ready soybeans kick in, and then Roundup Ready corn shortly after that. That's when pesticides have really kicked in and been used more exclusively. And the less pesticides you use, the better your soil biology is. We all know that pesticides are hard on soil biology. That's That's pretty easy to understand. Plus the corn and the corn oats rotation, it's a better rotation than corn on soybeans because you have that much more residue to break down. So again, you're getting that nutrient recycling back into and feeding the soil biology, and then of course you're getting that potassium back into that system. They did some short-term field trials. Of 2,121 short-term field trials where they used potassium chloride worldwide, 76% of those produced results that were non-significant. That means, significance it's a term to use in statistics to measure if something worked or basically it didn't work. And so 76% of the time it didn't work. It was non-significant, meaning 24% of the trials produced significant results. Well, that's not the best ratio there, is it? Most of the responses were on coarse textured soils, basically sandy soils that had low potassium availability and low potassium holding power, or where the residue was removed. So, like in a sand, for instance, the way I see it is the chloride is going to flow through that sand pretty easily, and the chloride isn't going to affect the soil biology as much as it would in say, a clay or a silt loam type of soil, where that chloride isn't going to leach down quite as quickly. So with a coarse textured soil, you have larger particles, and those large particles aren't as close together, say, as many small particles like a clay. A clay has many small particles, and they're all real close together. That's why you have tighter soils with a clay or a clay loam versus a sand. Remember to press *6 if you have background noise. They go on to say that potassium chloride, remember this is our normal potash that most co-ops use, can be even more of a concern in decreasing the yield. And they had field studies that showed that corn, soybeans, wheat, sugarcane, alfalfa, sugar beets, canola, and peanuts all showed yield loss from potassium chloride. And those yield losses were actually aggravated when they increased the rates of potassium chloride. And this kind of makes sense in the fact that the yield loss was due to a high salt index of potassium chloride. That's the biggest problem with potassium chloride, say, versus potassium sulfate is the high salt index. And a salt is simply taking, say, for instance, potassium, combining it with a chloride, and you have two different nutrients, you put them together, and they become a salt. Well, when they potassium chloride, for instance, has a salt index of about 116, and potassium sulfate is a 40, I think it's 48, something like that. So you're going to have a negative effect from that potassium chloride, and it also can affect germination and growth, and then also, of course, the soil microbial population. They go on to say legumes can be really sensitive to chloride as an anion toxicity, including soybeans and alfalfa. Now, what an anion is, it's a negatively charged element or nutrient. You have positively charged nutrients, which would be cations. An anion is negatively charged, and chloride is a negatively charged anion. So what it's doing is it's actually competing with nitrate nitrogen, and what happens is they can actually reduce the soil nitrogen availability by inhibiting nitrification in your soil. It competes, like I said, chloride competes with nitrates as a competitive anion, so they're competing with each other, and the chloride is actually decreasing the amount of nitrate. So it's hurting your nitrogen efficiency in your plant. And nitrate nitrogen promotes growth in the plant, so it can suppress growth, as we talked about earlier with the potassium chloride. Let's see. Chloride mobility in soils can also cause leaching of calcium. So chloride can flow all over the place in that soil, where calcium, it just kind of stays put and attaches to the CEC. Now remember, the CEC is basically, it's the pantry that holds all of your negative charges that soil can hold. And positive charges are attracted to negative charges. They combine together and then they marry up, and then they attach to that CEC, and then it stays in the soil, and you're not subject to leaching. So what the chloride is, with its mobility, it's actually knocking some of that calcium off and causing the calcium to leach. Do we have any questions, or am I going too fast? Or
I think, Dennis, too, this is Jim. I think one of the major things I see with potassium chloride is really destruction of the soil as far as its ability to hold the different particles together. Mm-hmm. And the salt index that you indicated, the negative effect that has overall, especially when you combine it with other salts that are applied to soils. And so I think loss of soil structure and aeration and getting air into the soil and compaction are a major thing. The interesting thing is, this is an article coming out from the university, but yet over the years there's been a lot of work done at Ohio State University along similar lines as the effect of potassium chloride on soybean yields. I remember several articles that were written probably 15 years ago in regard to that, but yet there's very little discussion of this specific topic in the agronomic world, and you wonder why.
Well, it's too much of a there's too much money in it is the thing, and potassium chloride is a much less expensive form of potassium, but and it's just what they're supplying to the farmers, and they've kind of got everybody believing that that's the way to go. But what we're introducing here is it may not be the way to go, and this paper is there's finally somebody that's coming out and saying that. But exactly what you were saying on the structure of that soil, when he was talking about the mud house, that's really the first time I've ever seen that in an article describing the detrimental effect of potassium chloride on the structure of soil. So it was really good to see.
Yeah, just like in the guy making the mud house, what you're doing is you're collapsing the soil, so you're driving out the air pockets, and you're tightening it up. So it's a stronger soil, or a stronger
bond.
brick.
Yep.
And when you drive those air vents or pockets out of soil, you do a tremendous amount of damage to your microbial population, because they need oxygen. You need those channels to bring air in so that you can get the nitrogen into the soil so you can synthesize it. So there's a lot of detrimental effects that occur in relationship to that. So, I think the bottom line is we need to be talking more about this, don't you think? And farmers really become better educated and take more control of their fertility program.
Yes, absolutely. And they have to know more of what they're putting on. They have to know what that fertilizer is and what it can do to their soil, detriment and positive. And they need to learn more about soil testing and how to read a soil test. And that's where we come in to try to help them do that.
But Dennis, what is we talked a lot about potassium chloride, and this last couple of years now we really have been more promotive of soft rock phosphate and potassium sulfate. So, how do you compare the potassium sulfate to the potassium chloride, and what are the advantages of potassium sulfate versus, and when we look at rates per acre, we look at effect, results.
Yep. I'm going to actually get into that a little bit later, but I will get into that, absolutely. Let me continue on here. So they did another survey, and it was a peer-reviewed, and it was university publications, and they wanted to they wanted to prove that KCl was essential for production agriculture. But what they found out was the exact opposite. Of more than 1,000 field experiments, only 8% showed positive responses to crop quality, and 57% showed negative responses. So it really backfired on them, which I think is kind of ironic. But there are a few positives for KCl, and one thing that they emphasized in the article was that it does increase fiber strength in cotton on soils that have low potassium holding capacity. Now, one thing I wanted to get into is a little bit on the potato industry, and I know there probably aren't a lot of potato farmers, but potassium chloride in potato production it's still being used across the world, and that's mainly because it's less expensive than potassium sulfate. However, the chloride can actually lower the starch content and the specific gravity. So you're going to ask, what is specific gravity? And according to Murray Hegney, and it's out of Australia is where I got this article from, but the specific gravity of potato tubers is an important criterion for processing potatoes. It's used as an estimate of the solids or dry matter content of tubers. The higher the dry matter content, the lower the water content, and the higher the specific gravity. Consumers, fast food retailers, and processors alike have recognized that the ideal French fry is light in color, crisp on the outside, fluffy or mealy on the inside, and has a minimum amount of oiliness. The ideal crispy fry is light in color and absorbs a minimum amount of oil during frying. So high specific gravity potatoes are what they need for good French fries. So the lower specific potatoes are definitely more costly because it takes more processing. They have more oil in them, and they actually have more fat in them, and so they're actually worse for us too, causing cardiovascular problems and things like that. So potassium sulfate is more the stable in the potatoes that are raised for, that are raised properly. Let's put it that way. And I know Ken works with quite a few potato growers, and I know they use potassium sulfate. So
the other problem that you have with your specific gravity is your storability. Also with your processing or your production quality is the storability of these for the farmer. If your shrinkage and your spoilage gets high, you can lose a tremendous amount of material out of a cellar just due to the fact that you can't keep them in condition and they spoil and rot. And so when you start dropping your specific gravity in these potatoes, your storability goes right through the floor, and your quality, there's no way that product is going to last or have a really receptive buyer, and so you're going to take a loss on the where it goes into the food chain and what can utilize it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, those some really good points. I appreciate your help on the potato part of it, because that's something I'm still learning on. So they also talked about the chloride also increases the mobility and plant uptake of cadmium. I found that really interesting, and that's cadmium is it's a major heavy metal, and it's been linked to breast cancer and different cancers like that. So that's kind of an interesting tidbit, if you will, on using potassium chloride. It can actually increase the cadmium. So Jim kind of touched on this a little bit ago, but he said, they were talking about applying too much potassium chloride can also have negative impacts on the bioavailability of calcium and magnesium, which can affect the crop quality, inhibit growth of legume bacteria, and nodulation in both soybeans and alfalfa. Jim talked about destroying the structure of the soil, and that's what they're talking about here, is that a bioavailability of the calcium and the magnesium, and basically the potassium and the chloride knocking that off. And then this goes all back to balance. And and trying to get your nutrients in the perfect balance so you don't have these types of issues. Okay, now where Jim wanted to go, potassium sulfate is a better choice than potassium chloride. Here's why. Okay. This has been 4 or 5 years ago, something like that. We were working with Dr. Scow, and he gave us 7 different reasons why potassium chloride is better, and that's where this is coming from. But more energy for the money. There's definitely more energy in potassium sulfate versus potassium chloride, and here's why. Potassium sulfate is made up of course, potassium and sulfur. Potassium is more for growing the plant. That nutrient's more for growing the plant. Sulfur is more for the reproduction. When you have a growth-producing nutrient and a reproduction-producing nutrient, and you put them together, they create energy, and they create an explosion of energy. Any fertilizer that you put together can create energy, but when you have growth-promoting and reproduction-promoting elements and put them together, you have this explosion of energy. So there's actually 5 times the amount of energy in potassium sulfate than there is in potassium chloride, because potassium chloride is potassium, of course, and chloride, and those are both growth-promoting nutrients. So when you put them together, there's only a little bit of a release of energy versus the huge explosion of potassium sulfate. Only 47% of the potassium chloride is actually usable by the plant, where 100% of potassium sulfate is used by the plant. So that makes a big difference too, and what you're getting for your money. And we'll get into the specifics on how much potassium chloride versus potassium sulfate, and the cost and that type of thing, but what you're getting for your money, you're getting a much better product with potassium sulfate. We touched on this earlier. Number 2 is the salt index. Potassium sulfate has a salt index of 46, and potassium chloride has a salt index of 116. There's a huge difference right there in salt index. And it's an easy way to judge how damaging a fertilizer is to the plant roots and its impact on germination. The higher the salt index, the more damage it can cause to the roots and killing off of the emerging seedlings, and it results in lower plant population. Better uptake of potassium. Proper uptake of potassium requires it to be in the phosphate of potassium form. When there is an excess of chlorides, the bonding of potassium with phosphate is blocked. The end result is less potassium uptake into the plant in that preferred potassium phosphate form. And the high level of chlorides in the soil solution following an application of potassium chloride undermines the very reason it was applied for. The sulfate form does not overwhelm the soil solution with chloride ions, and consequently more potassium is taken up by the plant in the phosphate of potassium form. This also leads to a higher utilization of that potassium, which will lead to higher bricks of that plant. You're going to have a much better chance of having higher bricks with the potassium sulfate form of fertilizer versus potassium chloride, just because of what we talked about here with the potassium and phosphate bonding. We've touched on this already, but the microbial stimulation versus microbial suppression, your chlorides are going to really, they're going to harm your microbes because of all that chloride. Potassium sulfate, when they put them together, they actually elevate the soil biology and stimulate it. So you have one that is really hard on the soil biology, and you have one that's promoting it. Of course, plants need sulfur. We used to get our sulfur for free from, acid rain, that type of thing, from power plants and different things like that, coal-burning power plants. That's no longer the case because now that we have stricter environmental laws to clean those up, we're not getting our sulfur for free anymore. So we definitely need to be putting it on. And potassium sulfate is just another way of getting some sulfur out there. And sulfur is important for amino acids rather, cysteine and methionine, and so we need that helps make the oils and protein. So it's very important for potassium sulfate. Less is more, and we kind of touched on this with the energy part of it. You can put on, say, 75 pounds to maybe 100 pounds of potassium sulfate, but you need to be putting on, 150 to 200 pounds of potassium chloride to make up that difference, because there's so much more of the potassium sulfate that is available versus the potassium chloride. Okay, now we're going to get into the pricing just a bit. Oh, there's one other study I wanted to discuss here.
Hey, Dennis.
Yeah, go ahead.
Real quick question. Potassium sulfate, what time of the year would be a good? Is this a fall applied or a spring applied? Is it better to put it in the spring so the plant has more of it for the growing season?
We would prefer to put it on in the spring because it does take 6 weeks to break down, and it would be better off to put it on in the spring. Now, also, potassium nutrient, how do I want to say that? The nutritious, the potassium requirements for the plant, for corn, for instance, there's a real increase in potassium requirements around V10, and then there's a large one at V12, V14, and then at around tasseling, and then it kind of drops off from there. So we want that potassium to be becoming available around that V10 stage so that we can hit those important areas so that we can help fill the length of the ear, and of course potassium is important for stalk strength and things like that too, and then there's a bunch of enzyme activities that potassium is responsible for. So definitely the spring would be a better time to put it on. Plus, if you put potassium sulfate on, you're going to have that sulfur becoming available later in the season too. And with sulfur, where's my chart? Sulfur is needed at RT, or tasseling. 90% of the sulfur is required after tasseling. So we want that sulfur to start to become available, right after tasseling, so that we can help create the oils and the starches and all those good things, so that we can also help fill that ear and fill test weight. So another benefit of putting that potassium sulfate on in the spring. There was one other study that I had from, it's been 3-4 years that I found this one, but from Sartain in 1988, and he was down in Florida. And what he did is he took different levels of rainfall, and he measured the amount of potassium that leached out. And the one I really want to focus in on is around 20 inches of rain. 75% of that potassium leached out on potassium chloride. Only 15% of the potassium sulfate, of the potassium and potassium sulfate, leached out. So there's a tremendous difference there, and there's your 5-to-1, your 5 times difference in energy right there, and in availability. So can you really, afford to put potassium chloride on? Now, again, in sand, you can put potassium chloride on and get along fine, because that chloride will leach down through the sand, and you're fine.
Another question for you, Dennis. Let's say you have your farming operation. You want to get your soft rock phosphate, your elemental sulfur, and your potassium sulfate. You apply it in the fall. Is there really a concern? Are you going to lose much of that potassium sulfate over the winter, or is that something that you're still going to get some, but maybe not quite as much?
I would think you're still going to have, it'll still be available, but I kind of want Ken to answer that.
It's a good question, Dave. The question is, I guess the answer is how do we want to manage our soil minerals? because we have two factors we have to consider. Once something goes into solution, we have other soil minerals that want to interact with it. And so we tend to have, over time, more tie-ups. The other one that we need to consider is soil leaching. And when we have a lot of fall moisture or we have a tremendous amount of spring moisture, any of the minerals that are there and in solution can be subject to loss. And so it's everything that we're talking about is so interconnected. The soil biology, the soil minerals, the soil mineral structures, plant roots. And it comes down to how efficiently we want to manage. Yes, you can put out SOP in the fall, but it's not as effective as having it out in the spring. And so you have to weigh the soil structure, you have to weigh the environmental factors, and you have to weigh, is it worth making an extra trip across the field? And, you know, some people have the flexibility, others don't in their farming operations, but you want to look at how you best utilize this, because these off-farm purchases are very expensive, and we need to have them in a timely, usable state that we don't have environmental factors making them unavailable or creating high losses for us on our fertilizer purchases. So Dennis, in what he's saying, he's right. I like the management system where you get the minerals into the plant, into solution, as timely as you can with the least amount of risk.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, even a better program, if you could band, for instance, soft rock in the spring or in the fall, and then band it, you know, band the potassium sulfate and whatever else you wanted to band in the spring. And some guys can do that, and, you know, others can't. But you're right. It's all dependent on, you know, does the guy want to do an extra trip across the field? And it would definitely benefit him to do that, but that's, you know, kind of the farmer's choice on how he wants to handle that.
Yep, it's efficiency, and it pays.
Yep.
Dennis, Dennis, this is Jim. I think I've noticed in the last year when, you know, operations get more than 1,500, 2,000 an acre, really manpower and time availability is the limiting factor.
Yeah.
It's not what often is the best strategy. And so I believe that, you know, the ideal way to put on plant nutrients obviously is in a zone, either banding in the fall or spring, your starter applications, your side dress, you know, spreading it out as much as you can. But reality says that most guys don't have the luxury to really go more than 2 operations a lot of times. So it's probably going to be either in the fall or spring. And I think the main thing that goes along with this is we've got to look at the biology in the soil. And so anything we can do to enhance biology is going to enhance the efficiency of the plant nutrients we put out there. And so another technology that we won't talk a lot about tonight, but really is the biorelease. And, you know, biorelease is a technology we can use in our cropping program, with our fertility program, with starters. There's other options, but mainly with the starter, side dress, that will help increase the efficiency of the nutrition and enhance our biology. So when we look overall, I think we got to look at, you know, kind of an overall comprehensive program of it's about minerals and microbes, and putting the right material there, as Ken said and you said. And I think the main thing that I think we have realized more and more in the last 4 or 5 years is, instead of just throwing stuff out there like potassium chloride, DAP and MAP in the fall and anhydrous and hoping for the best, not taking into consideration at all how does the plant growth, what is its growth habits, when does it need these different nutrients. Mm-hmm. We've gone more to trying to manage the type of product we're putting on there to provide the greatest benefit at the least amount of cost, but to satisfy the need of the plant when it needs it to achieve the yield goal that we set out. Mm-hmm. And so I think your discussion tonight plays right into that, of using potassium sulfate versus potassium chloride and then understanding how this particular product breaks down in relationship to potassium chloride and the availability for the plant, right?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Hey,
what's that?
Dennis, this is Dave Presto. Ken, touch on potassium thiosulfate for an option for these guys too. Let them know there is a liquid version and when it's best to put on and how it's applied and what your thoughts are on that, Ken.
Well, the liquid is an immediately available product. We don't have to wait for a breakdown period like we do in the dry SOP. It can be stabilized very, very excellent with biorelease, and it's an excellent product to sideband or side dress. And so it, again, it doesn't give us the toxic effects of the chloride, but it has a beneficial side for the growth side of the plant when it's side dressed, and also the sulfur is there for the filling, the protein, and the test weight of the grain as it feels in reproduction. And so it's typically, if you sometimes have to shop to get a pretty good price on it, but it's a good, effective product. We use it a lot out here in the West through sprinkler systems, but it would be an excellent side dress product there, banded to take care of those high weeks of potassium need in your corn and any of your cereal grains. What we're finding is, as we do the research on these plants, is just as the plant goes into set a major portion of its yield, it has this huge potassium uptake, because, as Dennis mentioned, potassium is a main driver in nutrient transfer in the plant, but it also runs 300-plus enzymatic systems that the plant needs vitally to grow and reproduce. And so as the plant goes into yield determination, there's this big urgency by the plant to take up this potassium. And so we need, for a few weeks on most of these plants, we need a high level of potassium that is much more in demand than throughout the rest of the growing season of the year. And so these liquid products can fit really nicely into that peak week or two demand cycle and be available for those plants.
Absolutely. And when you're side dressing, you're going to be real close to that, probably V6.
You're right on. You're just coming into it.
Exactly. And I wanted to touch on the sulfur requirements for both corn and soybeans. It takes 100 pounds of sulfur to raise 200 bushel corn. That's a lot of sulfur, and we, typically the industry has not been putting anywhere close to that on. And you do take your soil test results, and that's in parts per million, and then you convert that to pounds per acre by multiplying by 2. So you do have what's in your soil, and then you have to add the additional sulfur to get that, total of 100 pounds. But if you don't have that sulfur there, your test weight's going to be hurt. And remember that sulfur is needed in that, VT, and 90% of the sulfur is taken up after the tassel. So we need that sulfur to really fill that ear and to help with test weight. And if it's not there, it's not going to produce. And you're not going to get your oil in soybeans either, because sulfur is very important for soybeans for the oil. And you need a pound of sulfur per bushel of soybeans. So you need quite a bit of sulfur for soybeans as well. Just wanted to touch a bit on the cost between potassium sulfate and potassium chloride. At our current price on potassium sulfate, if you applied 75 pounds per acre, and that's kind of where I recommend, I would like to go higher in some instances, but a lot of times the price difference between that and potassium chloride is it won't really allow me to, but at 75 pounds per acre, it's around $35 an acre. If you take potassium chloride and you put on 150 pounds per acre, you're at $34 an acre. So you're right in the same ballpark as far as cost, and you've got a much better product at half the rate than you would at a full rate of potassium chloride because of all the negative effects of that potassium chloride versus the potassium sulfate. In addition, you're getting the sulfur that you need to provide that plant for reproduction and for oils and for fill. So that's really all I have on the potassium paradox, and now Dave was going to talk about the seed coating research that we just acquired.
Does anyone have any questions on the potassium side of it?
Well, yeah, this is Dick. I have a question. If you're just looking at lacking sulfur, you got potassium thiosulfate, and what is the other thiosulfate? Not the potassium, but there's another one available too, right?
Ammonium thiosulfate. That's
ammonium thiosulfate.
Yeah, it's a 120026 sulfur. They also call it thio. That's kind of some of the lingo in the fertilizer industry is thio or thiosol. But it's also a good urease inhibitor, meaning it prevents it prevents the loss of that nitrogen, prevents the breakdown, so you don't lose the nitrogen.
And what is the analysis of the potassium thiosulfate?
002517 sulfur.
Okay, thank you.
Dick, the other product that you could use is your elemental sulfur, but you have to take the breakdown at about 20% of your application rate. So if you apply 100 pounds, in the fall you would have approximately 20 pounds per year over the next 5 years as it breaks down and releases and changes from S2 to SO4. And so as it oxidizes, it becomes available. But it's about a 5-year breakdown, and so you can supplement some of your crop needs as we go through and start using some elemental sulfur to adjust some of the soil mineral imbalances.
Mm-hmm.
So it has multiple functions.
Ken, what is the if we if we didn't get the elemental sulfur on last fall, we need to get sulfur on this spring. The ammonium sulfate, what is the availability of that the first year applying that now this spring?
It's the very same breakdown period as potassium sulfate. You need 6 weeks after it's applied for it to become soluble and plant available. So give yourself that 6-week window. Ammonium sulfate, potassium sulfate, same time frame.
But the availability of the product itself is like 90%, or what would be the percentage of availability?
Oh no, it'll become soluble. It'll all become soluble depending upon your soil characteristics. And so these are good products. Your ammonium sulfate, your potassium sulfate, you should have a very, very high percentage of release and solubility out of those products. Every soil is going to be a little bit different on what you retain and how long you retain it, but I guess chemically and physiologically, they're good products.
Okay, thank you.
Unlike KCl, or unlike potassium chloride.
Another thing to consider here, everyone, is when you're trying to grow a crop, you need to have two mentalities. Number one, you got to feed the crop for this year. You got to make bushels this year to pay the bills and fill the bins and buy the fuel to drive your tractors. But you also have a mentality of building your soils for the next 10, 12, 15, 20 years. So that's where you can basically start two programs. Number one is I'm going to feed this crop to get maximum yield this year, but I'm also going to balance my soils and feed my soils so I can make crops 10 years from now. And that's where the different sulfurs come in. You might want to go with a potassium thiosulfate this year, but put a little elemental sulfur in to build for the next 5 years. So there's always two different ways of going about it, so everybody can make sure that they've got something to farm 10 years from now, which is a lot of guys forget that. All they farm for is this year, and they don't build the soils for the next generation. So it's just something to consider. Dennis, can you touch very lightly on where people can get potassium sulfate and potassium thiosulfate and elemental sulfur, and kind of where it comes from and where they can actually get some for their farm?
Yeah, the potassium sulfate we do have available. It actually comes out of Utah, and that's, it can be available bulk or in tote bags. We've got that available. And then the elemental sulfur actually comes out of Canada, and really you want to be putting that on in the fall, so I wouldn't advise putting it on in the spring, but definitely for next fall, especially maybe following like a wheat rotation, it allows you some flexibility to get out there and put, say, elemental sulfur on and soft rock or something like that in the fall, and you got a little bit more time frame to put it on versus if you take corn off, at least up here in the northern country, we don't have a lot of time, it seems like, to get fertilizer on, and it seems like everything's froze up, and I can't get tillage done or anything like that. So the elemental sulfur, yes, comes from Canada. Potassium thiosulfate, we'll have that available too. It's a liquid form, as we talked about. It's 002517 sulfur, and it can be applied in the starter, but you got to go low rates, like maybe 1 to 2 quarts at the most, depending on how you're placing it in your starter. If it's going right directly on the seed, I wouldn't go more than a quart for sure. But if you have like a totally tubular or something like that, that's below the seed is where that liquid would be going. So then you'd be, 2 quarts, you could go that way. And then in side dress, you can go 2, 3, 4 gallons even. It can get a little spendy if you go that much, but, a couple gallons would do a real nice job, I think. And then the ammonium thiosulfate, that's pretty common. We would carry it as well, but it's common at your co-ops too. And a lot of times they'll throw it in with 28%, like a side dress, or sometimes the ammonium thiosulfate will be sprayed with your pre-emergence herbicides too, to stabilize that 28%. So Dave, do you want to move on to the bioseed coat research?
Yep, we got a few minutes left, guys. We'll touch on it real quick. We are finding out that through some studies that adding some biology to the seed coating is producing some very tremendous results. It's not hard to do. It's very inexpensive, but it's very, very productive. We had a trial done with a company out in Indiana, Byron Seeds. They did a trial. They didn't tell us they were doing it. It's all non-biased. It has nothing to do with us. But they come back with a study over 5 replications. The average bushel bump was, I believe it was 37 bushel. Was that correct, Dennis?
Yeah, 37.5. But yeah, tremendous response.
Tremendous response. We are growing some seedlings in a greenhouse in our office there in Albert Lea, and we got photos of treated seed with the biology and non-treated, and these will be on our website shortly, but we actually put them under the microscope, and you can see the mycorrhizal fungi growing and the root hairs and the colonization, and it's unbelievable the difference of the vigor of the plant that's starting to grow and the root system. It's Jim, would you say it's double, or would you say it's a third more?
Well, I would say it's at least what was amazing to me, and of course we did this under ideal conditions in a greenhouse, but within 5 days we had mycorrhizae very noticeably growing on the root system of the plant, and I would say the root system was at least a third greater, and it's very, very noticeable. In fact, I think there is actually pictures put on the website for the teleconference call. If you go to our website, ProfitProAg.com, on there you can click on teleconference, and there will be photos on this.
It's under information. You just click on that, and it'll pull it up.
One thing, Jim, as I was noticing as I looked at these pictures, was the mycorrhizal is so much more effective. When you just talk about root mass, that's one thing, but when you talk about efficiency, this mycorrhizal is anywhere from 10 to 20 to 30 times more efficient in nutrient uptake than the hair roots of the original plant system, because the original plant doesn't put out a great deal of exudates that are strong enough to break these soil bondings with positive and negative mineral compounds. But the mycorrhizal do, and they have a much, much greater efficiency of going out and absorbing the nitrogen and the phosphate, potassium, sulfur, calcium, magnesium, the major, and even the trace minerals. They're so efficient at bringing these in. And so one factor is the root mass on the mycorrhizal may not be quite as dominant as some of the larger hair roots, but then you realize I've got so much more soil contact with these finer mycorrhizal roots that are so tremendously more efficient at taking up minerals. And that's why you're seeing this huge plant response so quick, and the plant's ability long-term to sustain taking up those minerals, it's dominantly coming from those fine mycorrhizal versus the hair roots of the plant.
And I think, Dennis, too, if we look at how this has been designed as far as the formulation, this is something that's, we've been working on for the last 15 years, and Ken's brought some things to the table. But not only are we putting on 11 different microorganisms, of course mycorrhiza are one of them, but we have many others like trichodermis, pseudomonas, azobacter. Most of these organisms are very effective in cycling and releasing nutrients, solubilizing, as well as fighting off pathogens. And not only that, but within the technology is a stimulant for these mycorrhiza fungi, and that's why we're seeing such a quick response. Normally, Ken, I don't know, it would take quite a bit longer if we didn't have this stimulation technology in the formulation, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. Mycorrhizal colonization takes time, and it's not a quick factor. And so this is absolutely thrilling to see that within days you've got mycorrhizal hyphae stretching out from these plants far in excess of the plant tiny hair roots. And this is dynamic, Jim. I mean, this is unheard of.
The other thing that we've got in here, that besides the microorganisms and the stimulator and solubilizer of nutrients, we've got 75 trace elements in here. And these are trace elements that are needed at very, very small amounts, but they're needed in the functioning of a plant. So I'm really high on seed coatings because you want to get this plant off to a good start. And I think one of the key foundations to high yield, good test weight, is getting a healthy seedling from day one, getting uniformity of stand. One of the things that was very apparent on this Byron seed study, and by the way, they're going to treat all of their organic and conventional corn with this technology this year, was the fact that we improved the stand and the uniformity. And that was a big part of the yield response that we saw under very adverse conditions. We all know that was cool and wet this spring. And so putting a seed treatment on really enhances the overall immune system and vigor of that plant. So, Dennis, maybe I would just comment on what we've got available as a company this year. We have Profit Coat MV, which is our kind of like our Cadillac seed coating. We've had it for quite a few years, and it's got a nitrifying bacteria in it. It's a liquid that goes on as a liquid. You can put an inoculant for soybeans with it. And then we have the Bio Seed Coat that you mentioned. We're looking at a cost of about $6 an acre, so it's very, very economical. And that's also a liquid. You can go on with a commercial treater, but it could also go on farm with a good nozzle auger type treater. And then we have the Profit Coat Planter Box, PB. And that is about $4.80 an acre. and that goes on at planting time. It's a dry formulation with the same technology in it. All three of these coatings have the same technology, except for the Profit Coat NB has extra stuff in it and a little higher levels. So that's our top one. And then on the soybeans, for the soybeans, it does not have rhizobium in it, so you can add the Graphics in with either the Bioseed Coat, the Profit Coat MB, or the Profit Coat planter box treatment for about $2.35 an acre, which is very economical.
Does anyone have any questions out there? No questions? Well, I'd like to say thank you to everyone that tuned in. We appreciate it. We hope you learned something. This will actually be on the website within a couple of days. You can go on and this recording will be on the website, plus past recordings are on there. And I'd like to announce that Profit Pro is moving to the 21st century here. We're going to be on Facebook and Twitter now, which I don't know that much about that, but I'm told we're on it. So if that is something you like to do, we're there. If you want to check us out, go ahead and join us on Facebook and Twitter. And look for new things on our website. We're updating it daily. And we appreciate everyone paying attention and joining tonight. And if anybody has any questions, now's the time to ask.
Dave, I would just like to mention that we have an early order discount program going on right now.
Okay.
And also our winter conference will be February 6th and 7th, which will have Dr. Don Hubert, Larry Acker, and Weather and Markets. And Dr. Don Hubert will talk, of course, about plant nutrition as well as the whole GMO issue and Roundup. And Ken Hamilton, who you heard tonight, will be there also. So get that on your calendar. It's going to be a fun event.
Yep. Anything else from anyone? Thanks for joining us. Thanks, Dennis.
Merry Christmas to everyone.
Yes, Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas, Ken, and thank you for being on.
Hey, thank you, Jim, Dennis, Dave, everyone.
Thanks. Yep.
Have great holidays. Talk to you again.